About 2 years ago, I told my daughter Sarah that I'd started dating someone. Her mother, my wife Margaret, had passed away 3 years earlier. I'd been alone. I'd grieved. I'd slowly started wanting companionship again. And I'd met a lovely woman named Barbara at my church, and we'd been spending time together, and it had turned into something romantic. I was nervous telling Sarah, but also excited. I thought she'd be happy that her father wasn't lonely anymore. The look she gave me is something I'll never forget. It wasn't just surprise. It was disgust, like I'd said something obscene. She said, "Dad, Mom's only been gone 3 years. How could you do this? What will people think? What about Mom's memory?" And I watched my 70-year-old self shrink down to about 10 years old, desperate for my daughter's approval, ashamed of something I had no reason to be ashamed of. I actually apologized. I backtracked. I said maybe I was moving too fast. I let her disappointment dictate my feelings about my own life. I went home that night and sat in my kitchen, and something shifted in me. I realized I'd spent decades making choices based on what my children would think. Decades of performing for their approval. Decades of letting their opinions shape my life. And here I was, at 70 years old, alone, finally finding happiness again. And I was going to give that up because my daughter made a face. Something in me said no, not anymore. That night was the beginning of a change that transformed my relationship with my children, my relationship with myself, and my entire experience of being 70. Today I want to tell you about it because I think there are a lot of parents my age who are still trapped in the approval-seeking pattern I finally escaped. Here's what happens when you raise children. You spend 20 or 30 years being evaluated by them. Are you a good parent? Do they approve of how you're handling things? Are they embarrassed by you or proud of you? It starts when they're teenagers, and suddenly your very existence is mortifying to them. It continues when they're young adults, and they start having opinions about your life choices, your politics, your habits. And by the time you're in your 60s and 70s, you've spent so long being judged by your children that you don't even realize you're still seeking their approval for everything you do. I see this pattern everywhere among people my age. They won't move to a smaller house because the kids want to keep their childhood home. They won't travel because the kids think it's irresponsible. They won't date after widowhood because the kids would be uncomfortable. They won't spend their own money on things they enjoy because the kids might inherit less. Over and over, elderly parents making decisions based on what their adult children will think, will approve of, will allow. And here's the crazy thing. The children don't even know they have this power. They're not consciously controlling their parents. They're just expressing opinions, making faces, showing disappointment when things don't go the way they expect. But we parents, conditioned by decades of caring what they think, treat these expressions like commands. We interpret a frown as a veto. We read disappointment as prohibition. We've given our children authority over our lives that they never asked for and don't even realize they have. I did this for years without seeing it. Every major decision I made, I ran through a mental filter of what my kids would think. Would Michael approve? Would Sarah be upset? What would they say at Thanksgiving? Their imagined reactions shaped my actual choices, and the result was that I wasn't living my life. I was living a performance designed to maintain their approval. At 70 years old, I was still trying to be a good boy so my kids would be pleased with me. Let me start with why this happens, because understanding it helped me break free from it. When you're a parent, your job is to raise your children to be functional adults. And the measure of your success, the report card you receive, is how your children turn out and how they feel about you. Did they become good people? Do they love and respect you? Are they grateful for what you did? We spend decades with these questions in the back of our minds, constantly evaluating ourselves through our children's eyes. But here's the problem. That evaluation never ends. Even after your children are grown, even after your job as active parent is complete, you're still seeking that approval. You're still worried about the report card. You're still trying to prove you're a good parent by maintaining your children's positive opinion of you. The dynamic that made sense when they were young, caring about their well-being and their view of you, becomes a trap when you're 70 and they're 40. The relationship inverts in a subtle but important way. You stop being the parent who guides them and you become the performer who needs their validation. You stop being the authority figure and you become the one seeking approval from authority. Your children, without intending to, become your judges, and you spend your golden years on trial, constantly defending your choices to an imaginary jury of your adult kids. I realized this pattern the night after Sarah's reaction to my dating. I sat there asking myself why I cared so much what she thought. She's my daughter. I love her. But I'm not accountable to her for how I live my life. I'm not obligated to get her permission before pursuing happiness. She's not my parent. I'm hers. When did those roles get so confused? The answer, I think, is that they got confused gradually over many years. Every time I made a choice and then worried about my kids' reaction, I gave them a little more power. Every time I changed my behavior based on their approval or disapproval, I reinforced the pattern. Every time I prioritized their comfort over my own authenticity, I taught myself that their opinion mattered more than my own experience. By the time I was 70, it had become so automatic that I didn't even see it anymore. Until that night. So let me tell you about what happened when I decided to stop caring what my children think. Not stop loving them, not stop valuing our relationship, but stop making their approval the governing principle of my life. First, I continued dating Barbara. I called Sarah the next day and said something I'd never said to her before. I said, "I love you, and I understand this is hard for you, but I'm going to continue seeing Barbara. Your approval would mean a lot to me, but I don't require it to live my life. I'm 70 years old, and I get to make my own choices about my own happiness. I hope you can support me, but if you can't, I'll still love you, and I'll still be your father, and I'll still be dating Barbara." There was a long silence. Then Sarah said, "I just don't understand how you can do this. Mom hasn't even been gone that long." And I said something else I'd never said before. I said, "You don't have to understand. I'm not asking for your understanding. I'm telling you what's happening in my life. I'd love your support, but I'm not asking for your permission." That was probably the hardest conversation I've ever had with one of my children. Sarah was upset. She cried. She accused me of being selfish, of not caring about her feelings, of disrespecting her mother's memory. I listened. I didn't get defensive. And then I repeated my position calmly. I was making this choice. Her support was welcome, but not required. I loved her regardless of whether she approved. She hung up angry that day. We didn't talk for about 2 weeks. That was painful. I second-guessed myself constantly. Maybe I was being selfish. Maybe I should just end things with Barbara to keep the peace with Sarah. The old pattern, the approval-seeking pattern, kept trying to reassert itself. But I held firm, not out of stubbornness, but out of a conviction that had been growing for years. I was too old to live for someone else's approval. Whatever time I had left, I wanted to live authentically. After 2 weeks, Sarah called. She wasn't warm, but she wasn't hostile either. She asked about my week, like nothing had happened. I told her about ordinary things, including that Barbara and I had gone to a concert together. Sarah didn't say anything negative. She didn't say anything positive either, but she didn't hang up, and that was progress. Over the following months, something interesting happened. Sarah slowly adjusted to the new reality. She met Barbara and was civil, then polite, then eventually even friendly. She stopped making comments about her mother's memory being disrespected. She started asking about Barbara by name. "How is Barbara doing? What are you and Barbara up to this weekend?" The thing she'd been so horrified by became normal, because I didn't treat it as something that needed her permission. And here's what surprised me most. Our relationship actually got better. When I stopped seeking Sarah's approval, when I stopped performing for her validation, I became more relaxed around her. I stopped carefully monitoring her reactions to everything I said. I stopped editing myself based on what might displease her. I became more myself, and ironically, she seemed to like that self better than the anxious, approval-seeking father I'd been before. I think what happened is that my confidence gave her permission to stop managing me. When I was constantly seeking her approval, she felt obligated to provide guidance, to have opinions, to steer me. It was exhausting for both of us. But when I started making my own choices without needing her input, she could just be my daughter instead of my supervisor. The relationship became more equal, more honest, more adult. Let me talk about the freedom of disappointing your children, because that's really what this is about. As long as you're terrified of disappointing them, they control you. Not intentionally usually, but effectively. Every decision you make runs through the filter of whether they'll approve. And that filter eliminates so many possibilities. Can't move to Florida because the kids would be disappointed. Can't spend money on travel because the kids are expecting an inheritance. Can't date because the kids would be uncomfortable. Can't. But when you accept that you might disappoint them, when you decide that's a survivable outcome for everyone, suddenly you're free. Disappoint them and love them anyway. Disappoint them and let them adjust. Disappoint them and trust that the relationship is strong enough to handle it. My daughter was disappointed about Barbara. She survived. I survived. We're closer now than we were before. Disappointment is not destruction. It's just discomfort, and discomfort passes. Here's another thing I learned. When I stopped seeking their approval, their respect actually increased. This seems backwards, but think about it. When you're constantly seeking someone's approval, you're signaling that their opinion is more important than your own. You're putting them above yourself. And while people might enjoy having that power, they don't respect someone who gives it away so completely. But when you make your own choices confidently, when you don't require validation, when you're clearly living according to your own values, people respect that, even if they disagree with your choices. My son Michael disagreed with some of my decisions over the past 2 years, but he's told me he respects how I've handled things. He respects that I'm not trying to please everyone. He respects that I'm living my life on my own terms. That respect means more to me than the approval I used to chase. Let me talk about the difference between living authentically and living for your children's comfort. When you live for their comfort, you make yourself small. You avoid anything that might upset them. You become a version of yourself that's designed to minimize their discomfort rather than maximize your fulfillment. You stop being a full person and become a careful curator of their experience of you. When you live authentically, you acknowledge that your children are adults who can handle their own emotions. You stop trying to protect them from reality. You let them see who you really are, including the parts they might not like or understand. You trust them to adjust, to grow, to accept you as a complete person rather than a one-dimensional character called Dad. I kept so much of myself hidden from my children for years. Political opinions I didn't share because they might disagree. Interests I didn't pursue because they might think they were silly. Feelings I didn't express because they might be uncomfortable. I presented an edited version of myself, a version designed for their approval. But that version wasn't me. Now I'm more myself with my children than I've ever been. They know I'm dating. They know I have opinions they don't share. They know I sometimes make choices they wouldn't make. And you know what? They still love me. Maybe even more, because they're finally seeing the real person, not the carefully managed image. I want to tell you about the specific moment I stopped caring what my children think, because it wasn't just a gradual shift. There was a moment when it crystallized, About 6 months after I started dating Barbara, I was planning a trip with her, a cruise to Alaska, something I'd always wanted to do. I mentioned it to Michael during a phone call, and he said something that hit me hard. He said, "Dad, don't you think you should wait? What if something happens to you on the trip? What if you get sick? Is it responsible to be gallivanting around when you're 70? Gallivanting. Like I was a teenager sneaking out instead of a grown man planning a vacation. And his concern was not really about my health. It was about his convenience. What if something happens and I have to deal with it? What if Dad isn't available when I need him? What if he's off living his life instead of sitting at home being a proper elderly father?" I felt the old pattern trying to kick in. The guilt, the obligation, the instinct to cancel the trip and reassure Michael that I'd stay put and be responsible. But then I heard myself, heard the thoughts I was having, and I felt disgusted. I was 70 years old, and my son was telling me not to go on vacation, and I was actually considering listening. I said, "Michael, I'm going on this trip. If something happens to me in Alaska, I'll deal with it there. I've spent my whole life being responsible and available and careful. I'm done being careful in that way. I want to live the time I have left, not just preserve it. I love you, but you don't get to tell me how to spend my retirement." He was taken aback. We'd never talked like that before. He apologized, sort of, said he was just worried about me. But I think he heard something in my voice that told him things had changed. Dad wasn't asking permission anymore. Dad wasn't available for guilt trips. Dad was going to Alaska, and if Michael didn't like it, that was his problem to manage, not Dad's problem to solve. That trip to Alaska, by the way, was one of the best experiences of my life. Barbara and I watched glaciers calving. We saw whales. We drank champagne on our balcony as the ship sailed through stunning wilderness. Nothing bad happened. I didn't get sick. I didn't need to be rescued. I just lived, freely, without apology. Let me address something important. I'm not talking about cutting off your children or becoming hostile to them. I'm not talking about ignoring their legitimate concerns or refusing to hear their input. I'm talking about something more subtle, but just as important. Making the final decision about your own life yourself. Listening to their thoughts, if they offer them, but not waiting for their permission. Loving them fully, while also living fully. My children still express opinions about my life. Sometimes they're helpful, sometimes they're not. But now I receive those opinions as information, not as instructions. I consider them along with many other factors, and then I decide. The decision is always mine. That's what it means to be the adult in your own life. It's been 2 years since I started this shift, since that night in my kitchen when something changed in me. And I can tell you honestly that my life is better in every way. I'm happier, I'm more relaxed, I'm more authentically myself. And surprisingly, my relationships with my children are healthier than they've been in years. Barbara and I are still together. We're talking about what the future might look like. Maybe we'll move in together. Maybe we'll get married. Maybe we'll just keep things as they are. Whatever we decide, it will be our decision, not my children's decision. That freedom is intoxicating after decades of seeking approval. I think about all the years I wasted worrying about what my kids would think, the trips I didn't take, the choices I didn't make, the parts of myself I kept hidden. I don't want to be too hard on my younger self because I was doing my best with what I understood. But I wish someone had told me earlier that I didn't need my children's permission to live my life. I wish someone had given me permission to disappoint them. That's what I'm hoping to do with this video. Give you permission. If you're in your 60s or 70s and you're still running every decision through the filter of your adult children's approval, I want you to know you can stop. You can make choices for yourself. You can disappoint them and survive. You can be authentically yourself and trust the relationship to handle it. Your children are not fragile. They can cope with you being a full person. They can adjust to decisions they don't love. They can learn to accept you as you are, rather than as they wish you were. Give them the chance. Stop protecting them from the reality of who you are and what you want. Here's what I want you to take away from this. You are 70 years old, or 60, or 80. You have lived a full life. You have raised your children. You have done your duty. You have earned the right to live for yourself now. Not in a selfish, callous way that ignores everyone else's feelings, but in a healthy, authentic way that puts your own judgment at the center of your own life. Your children are adults. They have their own lives to live. They're not your bosses, your supervisors, or your approval committee. They're your family, and family should be based on love, not on performance. Stop performing for them. Start being yourself with them. And if they struggle to adjust, if they push back, if they disapprove, hold your boundary gently but firmly. You love them. You're glad to have them in your life. But you don't require their permission to live. You never did. You just forgot that for a while. The day I stopped caring what my children think of me was the day I started living again. Not perfectly, not without complications, but freely, authentically, like a 70-year-old man who finally remembered he's in charge of his own life. If this resonated with you, please share it. I think there are many parents our age who are trapped in the approval-seeking pattern and don't even know it. Maybe this can help them see it. Maybe this can give them permission to break free. And subscribe to this channel if you haven't. Every week I talk about the real challenges and unexpected freedoms of aging. The things nobody prepares us for. The wisdom that only comes from living through things. Until next time, take care of yourself. And remember, you don't need your children's permission to live your life. You never did. Start living it anyway.